Move, or I'll move you. That was the first thing my grandson said to me that afternoon. His words, sharp and impatient, cut through the humid air by the poolside as if they had been waiting for months to escape his mouth. I wish I could say I was shocked, that I hadn't seen it coming, but the truth is, something in his tone felt like the inevitable conclusion of many small dismissals, little eye rolls, muttered sighs that I had ignored or explained away. I had been standing near the edge of the pool, holding a tray of lemonade glasses. They weren't even for him, they were for his friends, a group of teenage boys who had taken over my daughter's backyard like they owned it. I thought I was doing a kind gesture, the kind a grandmother always does, invisible but quietly essential. And then, without even looking at me, he muttered those words, loud enough for his friends to hear. I froze. Something about the way he said it, not joking, not playful, but edged with the arrogance of youth and the silent permission of those who never corrected him, made me pause. His friends laughed, one of them even egged him on, saying, "Yeah, push her." And in that moment, a tiny storm gathered in my chest. I had choices. I could have laughed, pretending I was in on the joke. I could have scolded him sharply, setting a boundary that should have been set long ago. Or I could have done what I did, step back. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't submission either. It was instinct. A quiet retreat, a surrender of space that said, I will not fight you here. I will not stand in your way. And then it happened. His body, which had been leaning forward, ready to make good on his threat, lost its balance when I moved. His hands swiped at the air, his face registered a flicker of surprise, and then, a splash. A clean, sharp sound, water exploding up in an arc, followed by the chaos of teenage boys shouting and running. For a brief second, time stretched. I saw the tray tilt in my hands, lemonade glasses toppling, sunlight hitting the liquid midair before it all came crashing down. I saw my daughter's curtains fluttering in the open window, the way they always did when the breeze from the pool carried inside. And I heard my own heart, not racing, but heavy, steady, like a drum marking the rhythm of something I hadn't yet named. He came up sputtering, of course. The pool wasn't deep enough for real danger, though for a terrifying half-second I thought it might be. He was soaked, his friends laughing even louder now, but the laughter had changed, it was crueler, directed at him instead of me. And his face, red and twisted with embarrassment, turned to me as if I had been the one to push him. You did that on purpose, he spat, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because in that moment I realized that nothing I said would matter. I walked back into the house, the broken tray still in my hands, shards of glass cutting into my skin where I gripped too tightly. I don't think children become cruel all at once. I think it happens slowly, like rust creeping across metal, or weeds taking over a garden when no one tends it. My grandson, I'll call him Daniel here, wasn't born with that tone in his voice. I remember when he was little, the way he would run to me with his scraped knees, how he would curl up beside me during thunderstorms because I told the best stories, how he once said, "Grandma, when I grow up, I'm going to buy you a house with a big garden so you never have to be sad again." That boy is gone. Or maybe he's still there, buried under layers of bravado. I didn't tell anyone, but I stayed awake most of that night. Not from the sting of the cut on my hand, though that throbbed each time I shifted beneath the sheets, but from the heaviness in my chest that no ointment could soothe. I kept hearing his words over and over, "Move or I'll move you." It wasn't just the sentence itself. It was the certainty with which he said it, the complete absence of hesitation. He had spoken to me as though I was an object in his way, something to shove aside, not a grandmother who once held his tiny hand steady as he learned to walk. When the first light crept into the room, I rose without waiting for the alarm clock. The house was quiet. My daughter and son-in-law were still sleeping. Daniel's room, I was sure, was a mess of tangled sheets and discarded clothes, just as it had always been. I padded to the kitchen in my slippers and made tea, the old way I always did, steeping the leaves longer than anyone else in the family liked. I poured it into a mug and sat by the window. From there, I could see the pool. The water shimmered in the early light, calm and clear, as if yesterday's chaos had never happened. That, I thought, is how life works in this house. Disruptions vanish quickly, smoothed over, and everyone acts as though they never existed. Except I couldn't smooth it over this time. Not inside myself. I remembered another pool, years ago, when my daughter was only 10. We had saved all summer for a week at a cheap lakeside motel, and she had begged me to teach her to swim. She wasn't a natural at first. She flailed, coughed, clung to me in panic. But I never raised my voice, never lost patience. By the end of the week, she was gliding across the shallow end, her smile wide and proud. "You didn't let me drown," she had whispered one night before falling asleep, as if it was the most obvious yet most important truth she knew. And now her son looked at me as though I was nothing more than an obstacle. I sipped my tea, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. I realized that the ache wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the way time had twisted things, the way the people I had given the most to now seemed to measure my worth only in how useful or unobtrusive I could be. Later that morning, my daughter came downstairs. She was dressed for work, hair pinned neatly, her face tired but alert. "Morning," she said, reaching for the coffee machine. "Morning," I replied. There was a pause. She busied herself with the mug, the sugar, the spoon, as though prolonging the silence. Finally, she sighed. "Daniel said he was embarrassed yesterday. You know how kids are. He feels like you set him up." I stared at her. "I didn't touch him." "I know." Her voice softened slightly, but only slightly. "But maybe next time, just let the boys have their space. You don't need to serve them lemonade. They can get their own." Her words landed heavier than she likely intended. Because beneath them, I heard the unspoken message: don't insert yourself. Don't be visible. Don't remind them you exist. I wanted to ask her something then, wanted to ask if she remembered all the times I had served her friends when she was young, how I had spent afternoons baking cookies so she could impress them, how I had quietly stepped back when she rolled her eyes at me in front of them. I wanted to ask if she had learned to dismiss me because I had trained her to, by always stepping back, by always accepting less space than I needed. But I didn't ask. I just nodded, and she kissed me quickly on the cheek before leaving for work. That afternoon, I took the bus into town. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just needed to breathe somewhere that wasn't filled with reminders of my smallness. I wandered through the market, letting the noise of vendors and shoppers fill me up. I bought myself a scarf, soft wool in a shade of deep green that I hadn't worn in years. I don't know why I bought it. Maybe because it felt like something just mine, something not chosen to please anyone else. I walked past a cafe I used to love when I lived alone, before I moved in with my daughter's family. Back then, I would sit by the window with a book, sipping slowly, no one rushing me. On impulse, I went inside. The same owner was there, older now, his hair grayer, but his smile just as warm. "It's been years," he said, recognizing me. "Still take your tea strong?" I nodded, and something in me softened. To be remembered, not just tolerated, not just accommodated, but remembered, felt like a luxury I hadn't realized I was starving for. I sat there for nearly an hour, letting the quiet hum of the cafe wrap around me. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, not just someone else's background character. When I returned home, Daniel was in the backyard again, this time with only one friend. They were tossing a ball back and forth, their laughter sharp and careless. I tried to slip past unnoticed, but his friend saw me first. "Hey, is that your grandma?" he asked, smirking. Daniel's face hardened. "Yeah. Don't mind her. She's always hovering." I stopped walking. His words weren't shouted, but they were loud enough for me to hear, and he knew I would. Hovering. As if I were some kind of insect, bothersome and unwelcome. I turned, meeting his eyes for the first time since the pool incident. "I was bringing you lemonade," I said, my voice calm, though inside, my hands were trembling. "That's not hovering. That's care." His friend chuckled. "Savage." Daniel flushed, the way teenagers do when caught between embarrassment and anger. Whatever, he muttered, turning his back. I went inside, my heart pounding. For a moment, I wondered if I had done the wrong thing, if speaking up would only make things worse. But then I thought of the notebook tucked under my pillow, the words I had written the night before. He said, "Move or I'll move you." And I realized that silence had never saved me. Maybe voice would. That night, I wrote again. He called me hovering. I said it was care. He turned away. The act of writing it down gave me a strange comfort, as though by recording it I was reclaiming a part of myself. It wasn't just about defending myself to him, it was about reminding myself that I had worth, even if they refused to see it. In bed, I thought about the scarf. I thought about the cafe owner who still remembered how I liked my tea. And I thought about how different I felt in those moments, how I wasn't invisible there. Maybe I had been wrong to step back all these years. Maybe the reason they treated me as if I were small was because I had made myself small to keep the peace. And maybe, though the thought frightened me, peace wasn't worth shrinking for anymore. The next weekend, my daughter hosted a barbecue. Relatives came, cousins and neighbors, the house alive with chatter. I stayed mostly in the kitchen, preparing salads, setting out plates, doing the work that kept me busy but unnoticed. But when I carried the dishes outside, I saw Daniel standing by the pool again with a group of friends. He glanced at me, then quickly away, as though I were something embarrassing. And I thought, no more stepping back. I set the dishes down on the table and, instead of retreating to the kitchen, I pulled out a chair and sat with the others. My brother-in-law cracked a joke, and I laughed louder than usual. A cousin asked me about my knitting, and I told her about the green scarf I had bought. Slowly, I felt myself inhabiting the space, not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a person. Daniel noticed. I could feel his eyes flicking toward me, narrowing slightly. For once, I didn't shrink under the weight of his disapproval. By the end of the evening, when the last guests left and the backyard was littered with plates and napkins, my daughter came up to me. "You seemed different tonight," she said cautiously. "Maybe I was," I answered, and left it at that. In my room, I opened the notebook again. This time, I didn't just write what happened. I wrote a promise. I will not always step back. Not anymore. As I set down the pen, I realized that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted in me, small, quiet, but undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not just tired, not just resigned, but awake. I thought that writing the words, "I will not always step back," would feel like a small declaration, a private reminder to myself. But in the days that followed, those words began to stir inside me like a seed pressing against the soil. They weren't just ink on a page. They were a challenge, and they asked me to prove them. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday evening. My daughter had asked me to watch Daniel while she and her husband went out to dinner with friends. I didn't mind. I had been watching him most evenings for years, though watching wasn't the right word anymore. He was 16, tall, independent, perfectly capable of looking after himself. My presence was less about care now and more about convenience. They wanted the assurance of another body in the house. When I brought him dinner, a plate of chicken and rice, the way he liked it when he was younger, he barely glanced up from his phone. "Just leave it," he muttered, as if I were a server at a restaurant. Something inside me clenched. The old me would have set the plate down quietly and walked away. But the new me, the one with a green scarf tucked in her drawer and a notebook under her pillow, stayed standing. "No," I said softly. His head snapped up, startled. "What?" I said no. "I won't just leave it. You can look me in the eye and take it from my hands. Or you can make your own dinner." His eyes narrowed, confusion flickering into irritation. "Why are you being so weird? Just put it down." I didn't move. My arms trembled slightly, not from the weight of the plate but from the weight of defiance. I held his gaze. For a long second, he looked at me as though testing whether I would break. Then, with a groan, he snatched the plate from my hands. Fine. Happy? No, I said. But honest. He rolled his eyes and turned back to his phone, muttering something under his breath. But as I walked away, I felt lighter. It was such a small thing, standing there, refusing to shrink. Yet it was more than I had managed in years. That night, when my daughter came home, Daniel told her Grandma was acting strange. She made me take the plate from her like I was 5. I braced myself for her irritation, the same dismissiveness as always. But to my surprise, she only shrugged. Well, maybe you should. She cooked it. It wasn't exactly support, but it wasn't condemnation either. And I realized something important: sometimes people don't defend you because you've never shown them you expect to be defended. In the days that followed, I began to test this new version of myself in small, careful ways. I wore the green scarf one morning when we went to the grocery store, though my daughter frowned at it and said, "That color's too loud for you." I smiled and said, "It's just loud enough." I started taking walks in the evenings, not asking anyone's permission, not announcing where I was going, just leaving a note on the counter, "Gone for a walk. Back soon." At first my daughter asked, "Why are you wandering around at night?" But when I answered, "Because I want to," she had no response. And in the quiet of my room, I kept writing in the notebook. I wrote about the cafe, about the scarf, about the moment with the plate. Each entry felt like another brick in something I was slowly building, not a wall, but a foundation. Of course, change never goes unnoticed for long. Daniel began to push back in his own ways. One afternoon, I overheard him telling his friend, "She's acting all different lately, like she thinks she's in charge or something." They both laughed, that sharp teenage laugh that stings more than it should. But instead of retreating, I stepped onto the patio where they were sitting. "I don't think I'm in charge," I said calmly. "I just think I matter." The friend looked startled, even embarrassed. Daniel flushed. "See? This is what I mean." "Good," I said, and walked back inside, leaving them in silence. I don't know what came over me in that moment. Perhaps it was anger, perhaps it was courage, perhaps it was both. But I knew one thing for certain: I had finally said out loud what I had been waiting years to admit, that I mattered, whether or not they saw it. One evening, my daughter and I sat together in the living room. She was scrolling through her phone, I was knitting, the television humming in the background. Out of nowhere, she said, "Mom, you've been different lately." I set the needles down. Different how? I don't know. Stronger. Sharper. Like you're not just going along with everything anymore. I considered her words carefully. "And how does that make you feel?" She glanced at me, caught off guard. "I'm not sure yet. Part of me, it's good, I guess. But part of me feels like you're changing the balance around here." "Yes," I said simply. "I am." She didn't reply. But she didn't argue either. And in that silence, I felt something shift between us, a recognition, however small, that perhaps I was no longer invisible. The real test came one Saturday, when Daniel invited half his school friends over without telling anyone. They spilled into the backyard, shouting, splashing, leaving wrappers and shoes everywhere. My daughter was furious when she came home to the chaos. "Daniel," she shouted, "you can't just invite people without asking." But Daniel only shrugged. "What's the big deal? Grandma doesn't mind. She'll clean it up." I felt the eyes of the room turn toward me, as if expecting me to nod, to take the blame, to accept the role I had always filled. Instead, I stood. "No," I said, my voice clear. "I will not clean up after this. If you invite your friends, you clean up your mess." The silence that followed was sharp. Daniel's mouth fell open. My daughter blinked at me, astonished. And then, slowly, she nodded. She's right. You heard her. Clean it up. For the first time, Daniel looked small, not because I had made him small, but because he realized I would no longer shrink for him. He muttered something under his breath, but he began gathering the wrappers, his friends grumbling as they joined in. I went to my room afterward, my heart racing. I sat on the bed, clutching the notebook. My hands trembled as I wrote, "Today I said no." And she agreed. She agreed. Tears blurred the ink on the page, not from sadness, but from a strange, swelling relief. For so long, I had thought it was too late, that the patterns of our family were carved in stone. But maybe they weren't. Maybe change was possible, even now. That night, when I went to bed, I thought again about the pool. About how he had said, "Move or I'll move you." About how I had stepped back, and how he had fallen. But now, for the first time, I wondered, what if stepping back that day wasn't weakness? What if it was the moment that finally made me see how much I had been stepping back all my life? What if his fall had been the beginning of my rise? The thought startled me, but it also warmed me. I turned off the light, pulled the blanket around my shoulders, and whispered to the dark, "I will not always step back." And this time, I believed it. The days that followed felt different, though nothing on the surface had changed. The house was the same, the rhythms of meals and errands and chores were the same, but inside me, something had shifted so deeply that even silence carried a new weight. I noticed it first in the way I carried myself. I walked a little straighter. My voice, once soft and uncertain, no longer trembled when I spoke. I began to occupy the kitchen table fully, spreading out my knitting, my notebook, my cup of tea, instead of arranging myself in the smallest corner. Even when no one was watching, I no longer behaved like a guest in a house I had lived in for years. But of course, people did notice. Daniel became sharper with me. He threw his sarcasm like pebbles, each one small enough to dismiss but together forming a pile. "Why are you always writing in that notebook?" he asked one day, sneering. "What could you possibly have to say that anyone would care about?" I closed the book gently, meeting his eyes. "I care about it," I said. He laughed, but the sound rang hollow. Figures. And for once, I didn't flinch. One evening, after dinner, my daughter lingered in the kitchen while I washed dishes. She dried a plate in silence, then said, "Daniel thinks you're different. He says you're standing up to him." I set a glass carefully on the rack. "And what do you think?" She hesitated. "I think maybe it's good for him. He's gotten a little too used to everyone doing what he wants." Her words startled me, not just because she admitted it, but because she said it without resentment. Almost with relief. "You know," she continued, her voice softer now, "when I was his age, you always made me feel like I could lean on you. Maybe it's time he learns he can't lean on you the same way. Not forever." I felt my throat tighten. "I didn't want to stop being the mother who carried everything for you," I whispered. "I know," she said gently. "But maybe now you don't have to." That night, I sat with the notebook open but didn't write right away. Instead, I stared at the words I had written over the past weeks, tracing them with my finger. Each entry was a small stand, a small refusal, a small reclaiming of space. Together, they told a story, not of a woman who had been moved aside, but of a woman learning how not to be. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to before: this wasn't just about Daniel. It wasn't just about my daughter. It was about me. About how I had spent decades being useful, being accommodating, being quiet, and how, somewhere along the way, I had mistaken that for love. But love, I realized, isn't about erasing yourself. It's about being seen. The next turning point came at a family gathering. My sister had invited us all to her house for her birthday, and it was one of those occasions where cousins and relatives came together, the rooms filled with overlapping voices and the smell of food. Normally, I would have drifted around the edges, picking up plates, fetching drinks, staying out of the way. But this time, I chose a chair at the main table. I sat, I laughed, I shared stories. My green scarf was around my shoulders, a splash of color I wore proudly. Daniel sat at the other end, surrounded by cousins his age. At one point, he said loudly, "Grandma's trying to be all fancy these days. Look at that scarf." His tone was mocking, his friends snickering. The table went quiet, eyes flicking between us. The old me would have smiled nervously, brushed it off, maybe even taken the scarf off to ease the tension. But not now. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but steady. "Yes, it is fancy. I bought it for myself. Because I deserve things that make me feel good." A ripple of laughter went around the table, but this time it wasn't cruel. It was approving, warm. My sister clapped her hands. "Exactly. You look wonderful." Daniel's face reddened. He muttered something under his breath and looked away, but I didn't chase his reaction. I had said what I needed to say. Later, my niece pulled me aside in the kitchen. "Auntie," she said, smiling, "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but I like it. You seem lighter." And for the first time in years, I agreed. But lightness doesn't mean ease. That night, when we returned home, Daniel slammed his bedroom door hard enough to rattle the picture frames. I sat in my room, listening to the muffled thump of his music through the wall. A part of me ached. He was still my grandson. I still remembered the boy who once pressed his sticky little hand into mine at the fair, who begged me for one more bedtime story. It hurt to be the object of his contempt. But I also knew, sometimes love isn't about protecting someone from discomfort. Sometimes it's about refusing to let them harm you, even if they call that refusal cruelty. I picked up my pen and wrote, "Tonight, I did not shrink." And it hurt. But it also healed. The weeks went on. My walks became longer, stretching into the park, where I began to recognize familiar faces, other women of my age, walking dogs, carrying groceries, sitting on benches. I struck up conversations. It felt awkward at first, but then natural. We exchanged small details about our lives, tiny threads that wove me back into a world outside the house. One woman, Helen, invited me to join her book club. I hesitated, I hadn't been part of a group like that in years. But then I remembered my promise, I will not always step back. So I said yes. The first meeting, I was quiet, listening more than speaking. But by the second, I found myself laughing, sharing my thoughts, even disagreeing with someone, gently, respectfully, but without apology. When I left that evening, scarf wrapped around my shoulders against the chill, I felt almost giddy. I was part of something again. Back at home, Daniel noticed the changes too. "Where do you keep going all the time?" he demanded one evening, his tone sharp. "I have friends," I answered simply. He scoffed. "At your age?" I smiled. "Especially at my age." For a moment, he looked unsettled, as if he didn't know how to argue with that. Then he muttered, "Weird," and stomped upstairs. But I sat in the living room a little taller, my knitting in my lap, my notebook on the side table. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my daughter knocked softly on my door. "Mom," she said, stepping inside, "I just want to say, I've noticed how much stronger you've seemed lately. And I'm proud of you." Her words undid me more than Daniel's insults ever could. Tears filled my eyes. "You are?" I whispered. She nodded. "I think. I forgot sometimes that you're more than just my mother. You're a person. And I'm sorry if I treated you otherwise." I reached for her hand, squeezing it. "I let it happen," I said. "But I'm learning not to anymore." We sat together in the quiet for a while, mother and daughter, the years between us folding and unfolding like fabric. For the first time in so long, I felt not just needed, but seen. As I lay in bed afterward, I thought again of that moment by the pool. Of how I had stepped back, and how Daniel had fallen. And it occurred to me that maybe life had its own way of teaching lessons. Maybe his fall wasn't punishment, but a mirror, showing me how much I had been falling all along by moving aside. Now, I wasn't falling anymore. I was standing. And the world, slowly but surely, was beginning to notice. By the time spring began to press its green fingers through the garden, I had become someone different in my own house. Not louder, not harsher, simply firmer, steadier. I had stopped apologizing for taking space. I had stopped waiting for permission to do ordinary things. And I had started to say no, in all the small places where yes had worn me thin. It was remarkable how those little changes rippled outward. My daughter spoke to me differently now. Less clipped, less distracted. She began to ask me questions, real questions, not just practical ones. "What do you think of this dress?" she'd ask before work. Or, "Would you come with me to the garden center this weekend? You always pick better flowers." They weren't grand gestures, but they were openings, acknowledgments that I was more than a background figure. Daniel, on the other hand, grew restless with the shift. He had grown used to my compliance, and now, confronted with my quiet boundaries, he tested me more often. One afternoon, he stormed into the kitchen while I was knitting. "Why do you keep writing in that notebook?" he demanded, his voice sharp with teenage irritation. "Are you keeping secrets about me?" I looked up, calm. "I'm writing about me." He scoffed. "What could be so interesting about your life?" I smiled faintly. "Plenty. You'd be surprised." For a moment, he stood there, unsettled. Then he muttered, "Whatever," and left. But I noticed something in his eyes, confusion, perhaps even curiosity. He was beginning to realize that I wasn't as easy to define as he had thought. The real confrontation came a few weeks later. It was another pool day. The air was heavy with the scent of chlorine and cut grass. Daniel had friends over again, their laughter ringing across the yard. I watched from the kitchen window as they splashed and shouted, a tangle of limbs and bravado. I had no intention of interfering, not this time. But then I heard it, the same mocking tone he had used before. "Careful," one of the boys said, grinning. "Don't let your grandma get too close, or she'll knock you in again." My chest tightened. I saw Daniel laugh, but it wasn't the laugh of embarrassment. It was the laugh of agreement. Something in me broke open. I wiped my hands on a towel, walked outside, and stood by the edge of the patio. "That's not what happened," I said, my voice clear, louder than I usually dared. The boys fell silent. Daniel's face shifted instantly into irritation. "Grandma, go inside. You're embarrassing me." "No," I said. The word was small, but it landed like a stone. "I will not let you rewrite what happened. I did not push you." I stepped back. "You fell. That's the truth." A ripple of unease passed through the group. One of the boys glanced at Daniel, uncertain. Another looked at me with something almost like respect. Daniel's cheeks flushed crimson. "Why do you always have to make everything about you?" "It's not about me," I said softly. "It's about honesty. And respect." The silence that followed was thick. Daniel kicked at the ground, muttered something under his breath, and finally stalked off, leaving his friends to cover their discomfort with half-hearted jokes. I stood there for a moment, feeling the sun hot on my shoulders, the water shimmering at my feet. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From release. I had said it out loud. I had refused to let the lie harden into fact. When I went back inside, I wrote in my notebook, "Today I spoke the truth." And the world didn't end. After that day, something changed between Daniel and me. He avoided me more, yes, but he also watched me differently. His jabs grew less frequent, as though he wasn't sure they would land anymore. And occasionally, only occasionally, I caught him looking at me with something like thoughtfulness, as though he was beginning to question the story he had told himself about who I was. My daughter noticed too. One evening, she sat across from me at the table after dinner, her wine glass in hand. "Mom," she said quietly, "I think you're teaching him something. Even if he doesn't see it yet." I raised my eyebrows. "And what's that?" She smiled faintly. "That you don't get to treat people like they're invisible. That if you do, eventually, they'll stop letting you." Her words lodged deep inside me. For years, I had felt invisible, not because no one looked at me, but because they looked through me. Now, for the first time, I felt solid again, like someone who couldn't be erased so easily. It wasn't all triumph. Change never is. There were days I doubted myself, days I felt guilty for standing firm, days I wondered if maybe I was being selfish after all. Old habits don't die easily, they whisper at you when you're tired, urging you back into silence. But then there were the other days, the walks in the park with Helen and the book club women, the mornings when I tied the green scarf around my neck and smiled at my reflection, the evenings when my daughter lingered to talk instead of rushing past me. Those days reminded me why I had started this. And gradually, something extraordinary happened. I began to feel not just stronger, but freer. One evening, near the start of summer, I sat outside alone after everyone had gone to bed. The pool was still, the moonlight shimmering across its surface. I thought about that first day, about Daniel's threat, about the splash of water, about the sting of glass in my hand. And I realized something: the pool was no longer just a place of hurt for me. It was a marker, a turning point. The place where I had finally seen clearly the cost of always stepping back. I closed my eyes, breathed in the cool night air, and whispered to myself, "I am here. I matter. I will not disappear." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled inside me like roots, steady and deep. Not long after, I decided to take another step. A bolder one. I told my daughter I wanted to visit my old neighborhood, the place I had lived before moving in with them. I wanted to walk the streets, see the bakery that used to know my order, sit on the bench near the park where I once spent afternoons. She looked at me with surprise. "Of course, Mom. We can go this weekend." "No," I said gently. "I want to go alone." Her eyebrows lifted. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "I need to." And I did. That Saturday, I boarded the bus by myself, clutching my bag and my scarf. The ride felt like a pilgrimage. When I stepped off and saw the familiar streets, something inside me cracked open. I walked past the bakery, and though it had changed owners, the smell of fresh bread still lingered. I sat on the old park bench, tracing my fingers over the worn wood. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was visiting not just a place, but a version of myself I had left behind. I whispered to her, the woman I used to be, the one who lived here, independent, whole, "I'm coming back to you." When I returned home that evening, tired but glowing, my daughter looked at me with wonder. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I replied. And it was true. That night, in my notebook, I wrote, "I stepped back. He fell. But I am the one who has been learning how to stand." And as I set the pen down, I knew this was not the end of my story. This was the middle, the thick of it, the part where change roots itself so deeply that it cannot be undone. Summer deepened. The air grew heavy with heat, the pool shimmering each afternoon like a mirror I could not help but glance into. Every time I passed it, I remembered that day, the sting of his words, the splash of his fall, the silence that followed. But the memory no longer wounded me the way it once had. It felt distant now, like the first sharp stone on a path I had already walked far beyond. One evening, Daniel came into the kitchen while I was making tea. His voice was quieter than usual, uncertain. "Grandma?" I turned, surprised by the softness. "Yes." He shifted his weight, looking anywhere but at me. That day at the pool. I know I said you pushed me. But I know you didn't. I just didn't want to look stupid in front of my friends. The kettle whistled, sharp and shrill, but I didn't move to take it off the stove. I just looked at him, letting the truth sit between us. He swallowed. I'm sorry. Slowly, I reached over, turned off the flame, and poured the water into my cup. My hands no longer trembled. Thank you for saying that, I told him. He nodded, awkward and tall, no longer the boy who once clung to my hand but not yet the man he would become. I didn't mean to make you feel small. I stirred the tea. But you did. And maybe I let you. But not anymore. For the first time, he looked at me fully. His eyes searched mine, not with defiance, but with something closer to recognition. He didn't reply, only gave a small nod before slipping out of the room. It wasn't reconciliation, not entirely, but it was the beginning of one. Later that night, I sat outside by the pool alone. The air was cool, cicadas humming. The water lay still, reflecting the stars. I thought about how easily it could have gone another way, how I might have kept shrinking, kept stepping back, until I disappeared altogether. But I hadn't. I had chosen, finally, to stand. And standing hadn't made me harder. It had made me clearer. To my daughter. To Daniel. And, most of all, to myself. I touched the edge of the scarf around my shoulders, its fabric soft against my skin. I thought about the notebook in my room, its pages filled now with words I once believed I had no right to write. They were proof, not to anyone else, but to me, that I had lived, felt, mattered. I whispered into the night, not as a vow, but as a truth already lived, I will not always step back. And for the first time, I felt the world itself lean forward to meet me. The pool no longer frightened me. It reminded me. It stood as a line between who I had been and who I had become. My grandson had fallen that day, but I had risen. And though my rise was quiet, almost invisible to the world, it was everything to me. Because at last, I had claimed the simple, unshakable truth. I mattered. And I always had.